There are these anti-India tropes, and ultimately I think they come down to a casual, residual anti-Hinduism among Western ruling classes. Well, I don't think it's indirectly asking for foreign intervention. It's directly asking for foreign intervention, not military intervention, but certainly diplomatic intervention in India's internal affairs. And I think that's simply going to rebound to harm Rahul Gandhi and the Congress Party. Winston Churchill, right, who was utterly disparaging about Mahatma Gandhi and even about Jawaharlal Nehru. He sneered at these people as being almost subhuman, certainly sub-British. That sort of elite anti-Hinduism remains today embedded in a few elite institutions. Now, the original name is Free and Fair Elections, which is supposed to measure, is the election free and fair? On this, India scores worse than Hong Kong, and about even with Vietnam. Now, he said, how's that possible? Hong Kong is ruled by communist China and has no choice whatsoever. Any opposition is banned. Vietnam is a one-party communist state. How could its elections be on a par with India and Hong Kong's elections better than India?
Namaskar and welcome to Samvaad. Samvaad is a platform where we invite the best and the brightest mind to deliberate and discuss on topics related to international relations, geopolitics, and public policy. Today, we have a very special guest with us, a person who has captured India's heart with his smile, wit, and humor, Dr. Salvatore Babones. Dr. Babones is someone who calls himself as a Khan market gangster. But in reality, he's an associate professor of sociology at University of Sydney. He is a prolific author and editor of over 14 books. He is currently researching a book on Indian democracy, and Dr. Babones regularly features on Indian news channels. Dr. Babones, namaskar and welcome to Samvaad.
Mahadev, thank you for the invitation. Ever since my trip to Varanasi, Mahadev has become my new greeting.
Right, sir. Mahadev. Sir, before we move on, at the beginning, we just would like your brief analysis on India's democracy and its performance since independence. How would you rate our democratic structure?
I always say that India is an extraordinarily successful democracy, and I use that word because India is not an ordinarily successful democracy. Ordinary democracies are rich, Western, Atlanticist, or at least on the rim of the oceans. To be a poor Eurasian post-colonial democracy is a true exception to the rules of how democracy works in the world. And that's what drew me to the study of Indian democracy. Now, India hasn't always been extraordinarily successful. I would say up till 1977, India's trajectory was fairly typical. India had a national liberation movement that, against the advice of Mahatma Gandhi, morphed into a political party. The leader of that political party became prime minister and seized it and kept in that role. So Jawaharlal Nehru didn't relinquish power throughout, until he died in office. Then, after a brief interregnum, he was succeeded by his daughter, who solidified or attempted to solidify dictatorial rule in India. Now, that's a pretty typical trajectory. You can find that all around the world. You can even find it among India's neighbors. What happened in India that was distinctive is that Indian society fought back against that. So whether that's on the one hand, groups like the RSS and the Hindu, the other Hindu nationalist organizations that were associated with it, the broad Sangh of organizations, or on the other hand, members of the Congress organization who refused to go along with Indira's one-woman rule in India. So there were a lot of people who were willing to risk imprisonment, destruction of their careers, simply loss of prestige and power in order to stand up for the principle of democracy that they believed in. I mean, more than 100,000 people became political prisoners during the emergency. Well, right there, that tells you that 100,000, I mean, what is that in Indian in Indian numbers?
1 lakh.
People were willing to sacrifice everything because they truly believed in democracy. And I think that's what really set India up on the path to being an extraordinary democracy. Up until 1977, it's setting the familiar pattern that we've seen all over the third world. Since 1977, India has become a truly extraordinary democracy. We can quibble around the edges about whether we agree or disagree with this Supreme Court ruling or that government policy. But in essence, India is a well-institutionalized, well-functioning democracy that is truly exceptional on the global stage.
Right, sir. Sir, we'll move our focus to the rankings and indices, something which you passionately take up.
Right.
So if we look at all the rankings and indices which have been coming in our way, we look at the World Hunger Index, where India has been ranked lower than country who are dependent on India for aid. Then, sir, we have this very famous ranking of VDEM, where which basically ranks performances of the liberal democracies. And according to them, India is one of the worst autocracies in the last decade. The ranking of India has been getting worse with each year. So what do you think is the reason? Because, we are ranked in the VDEM ranking, we are ranked lower than Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. So what is the reason for this?
Look, let's leave aside the World Hunger Index. That's a technical index that for technical reasons India scores poorly on. And I'm not even willing to say India scores poorly. I would just say India has Indian people are not as heavy as people in the rest of the world. That's really what the World Hunger Index comes down to. Let's leave that aside. Let's also leave aside silly rankings like the Global Happiness Index, things like this. So, again, let's focus on the really serious, methodologically sophisticated indices like the Rise of Democracy Institute Electoral Democracy Index. Now, the Electoral Democracy Index is highly sophisticated. It's based on an enormous data collection exercise. It has a well-established statistical methodology. It should be incredibly sound. And yet, India in the latest index, which came out March 1st, is rated 108th in the world. The VDEM Institute, short for Varieties of Democracy Institute, VDEM classifies India as an autocracy on a par with China. So although India has a much higher score than China for elections, they classify India as an electoral autocracy. And they, in all of the writing around the report, they suggest that India's electoral autocracy and China's non-electoral autocracy are responsible for the world becoming more autocratic. That is, they put the two countries together as just varieties of autocracy instead of varieties of democracy, which is, of course, crazy. But that's the approach that's been taken. Now, India's low score on the VDEM is due to several factors. And I come to you as a statistician, a social statistician, whose own area of statistics is international metrics. So what I do, what I've written books on, is how we use national data or country level data to study relationships among countries. Okay, there are some very specific reasons why India is ranked low. If you have a few minutes, I'll go into the technical details. VDEM has 5 sub-indices that together compose its electoral democracy index. On the first 2 of them, which are universal suffrage and elected officials, meaning essentially, is everyone allowed to vote, and are the officials elected as opposed to appointed? They make no distinction among roughly 139 countries in the world, all get the same score. Okay. Now, that means India, right away, on the objective measures of democracy, can you vote and can you elect your chosen officials? India gets the same score as Vietnam, Cuba, North Korea, right? So it just doesn't matter. Objectively, the fact that India has an objective democracy with objective choice is irrelevant to VDEM. And they actually say that. They say that their elections subindex includes sham elections in which people have no genuine choice. Well, what is it measuring? It's not measuring anything at all. Okay, their third index is free and fair elections. They've changed the name of it to, I'm forgetting the new name, but the original name is free and fair elections, which is supposed to measure, is the election free and fair? On this, India scores worse than Hong Kong, and about even with Vietnam. Now, they said, how's that possible? Hong Kong is ruled by communist China and has no choice whatsoever. Any opposition is banned. Vietnam is a one-party communist state. How could its elections be on a par with India and Hong Kong's elections better than India's? Well, again, it's because of the pro forma criteria that are used. That is, VDEM is asking questions like, was there violence at the polls? Well, in India, there was more violence than in Hong Kong because there's no election in Hong Kong or Vietnam. Is the electoral register complete, or are there questions about who should be on electoral? Well, again, in Hong Kong, the electoral register is magnificent. Every single person is recorded. You just can't vote. But in India, of course, there are questions about, did your family arrive in India before a certain year, and are you thus eligible to vote as a citizen, or are you a refugee? There are questions around this. So when we go down to the technical questions they ask, Hong Kong actually scores better than India on everyone, except there's a catch-all question number 8, which is, were the elections really free and fair? Hong Kong gets a low score. Okay, but on all the others, Hong Kong, not all the others, most of the others, Hong Kong does better than India. So these are the 2 objective indicators of democracy, and the one, all right, subjective but very firm indicator. Then you go to their 2 completely subjective indices, which are freedom of expression and freedom of organization. On these 2, India has been pilloried. And India has been pilloried by the expert analysts who answer the survey given by VDEM, who ask them questions like, can reporters freely report? Can academics freely pursue their studies? Can people freely express their opinion? And India's evaluators, that is, the Indian intellectuals who are in the survey for VDEM, have said, no, these metrics have gone way down in India. And similarly, on freedom of organization, India is ranked on a par with Vietnam. Now, India is a country where, yes, there's some modest restrictions on international NGOs operating in India. They're allowed to take foreign money, but they have to report it. Okay. In Vietnam, of course, again, it's a one-party communist regime. You can't just form an NGO without the approval of the government. Yet, Vietnamese experts and Indian experts have rated the 2 countries at the same level for freedom of organization. Okay. Nowhere in this is a simple, basic question asked. I'm sorry, it is asked. Nowhere in this is a simple, basic question prioritized. Can you form an opposition political party? I mean, that's only one tiny element. So VDEM has 5 main indices. One of them is freedom of organization. Within freedom of organization, one of the dozen indicators is, can you form a political party? And that, of course, is the crucial question, right? Can you oppose the government? Doesn't appear. So the result of all this is that horribly flawed democracies, for instance, Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast is a country where there's one ruling party. They've been in charge for a couple decades. The president is from that party and won with a 95% vote. I mean, imagine if Narendra Modi got a 95% vote. One with a 95% vote. The main opposition leader has been exiled from the country, and opposition politicians have essentially been hounded out from being able to stand for election. And yet Ivory Coast is ranked above India because in the views of the VDEM experts, formally in its constitution, Ivory Coast is, everyone can vote. 2 objective indicators. Everyone can vote and all officials are elected. Formally, same as India. And then on the subjective indicators, on things like, can international NGOs operate? Yeah, sure. So the only problem in Ivory Coast is you can't actually oppose the government. And that problem becomes just a tiny component of VDEM. All right, so that's where all the problems come in with VDEM. And the same sorts of problems affect Freedom House, Freedom in the World. The same sorts of problems affect the Economist intelligence unit, and then other democracy rankings like the Cato-Fraser Freedom Ranking, that just pulls data from VDEM. So a lot of the other rankings just pull VDEM data and recalibrate it in different ways.
Right, sir. So we would like to discuss the situation with Indian elites, or should I say Indian liberal elites, because, you know, if you see these liberal elites, they have been fostered by the early Nehruvian socialism, and if you see, we affectionately call them the Lutyens lobby or the Khan Market gang. And
Khan Market gang, that's my people.
Right, sir. So, sir, I'd like to point your attention towards this survey which came out by Thomson Reuters, and it ranked India as the worst country for women's safety. We were ranked lower than Afghanistan, Syria, and Pakistan. So, naturally, because the thing is that in the per capita rape incidents in India is among the lowest, because see, we have a very large population, so obviously the nominal numbers will always be high. But so this led to a lot of outrage among Indian circles, and Thomson Reuters, they came forward and they said, look, it was not us. We invited experts from your country. Indian experts who said that you should place India at the bottom because India, it is a rape capital. So, this points towards a very self-loathing attitude of our liberal elites. So what are your views on this?
Well, it's not self-loathing in that they're not rating themselves badly; they're rating their country badly. Look, I haven't gone into detail into the Thomson Reuters survey. I've done work on the International Religious Freedom Rankings, which portray a similar sort of. India is ranked worst in the world for social hostility to religion, despite the fact that 98% of India's Muslims and 98% of Christians say they're free to practice their religion. Right, so we have similar kind of things with freedom of religion. What this comes down to is experts rating their own country badly, and that's true whether it's violence against women, freedom of religion. World Press Freedom Index is based on leading Indian journalists saying that, again, journalism in India is less free than in Hong Kong, which is where the Apple Daily has had its presses destroyed by government goons, and then its founder spirited off to a secret prison in China. And India is supposedly worse. And the key things to keep in mind here are, first, these are not objective evaluations being made by Western organizations. These are surveys being done of people in India who are and I always stress this, they're the proper people to be asking. Okay. If you want to know about women's safety in India, you go to women's rights NGOs and you ask their leaders to fill out a survey about safety in the country. They're the people in a position to know. Now, if they say that their country is terrible, how is Thomson Reuters supposed to correct that? I mean, what if they said their country was great? Wouldn't you be upset if Thomson Reuters said, no, we don't believe you, we're going to downgrade you? Okay, so Thomson Reuters and other organizations, Reporters Sans Frontières, Pew Research Center, they have to take these opinions seriously. That doesn't mean these opinions are correct. Now, specifically with violence against women, we can't go to rape statistics because rape statistics are notoriously poorly reported. Many women simply don't report rape. Some men don't report rape, even men who've been the victims of rape as well. So we can't really trust international comparisons of actual statistics, and that's the problem. But even in places where we have statistics, many of these international rankings instead are based purely on expert opinion, when they could instead go to the stats, but it's much easier just to do a survey and ask the experts.
Right, sir. Sir, I like your views on the recent visit of one of our biggest opposition leader to United Kingdom. And I'm pointing towards Mr. Rahul Gandhi. And, he went there and he gave a talk in Cambridge. And in one of the talks, he says that the United States and Europe, they are not doing enough to restore democracy in India. This is after, in 2014, when they lost election, when the Congress party lost election, they said that, we humbly accept whatever the view of the people of India are. So in 2019 also, when Prime Minister Modi, he got a second term, they accepted the results of the elections. Here, sir, do you think this points towards a certain desperation of the opposition leader? And do you think this is not indirectly asking for foreign intervention in Indian internal democratic process?
Well, I don't think it's indirectly asking for foreign intervention. It's directly asking for foreign intervention, not military intervention, but certainly diplomatic intervention in India's internal affairs. And I think that's simply going to rebound to harm Rahul Gandhi and the Congress party. That is, it's simply not an attractive message. Whether or not it's true, let's leave whether or not it's true aside. It certainly is not going to look good. And I've noticed Indian political analysts, especially one of my own India gurus, Rajdeep Sardesai, criticizing the government for relentlessly repeating, these accusations against Rahul Gandhi of that he's turning to foreign powers. And I think, well, but he's a leader of the opposition. Maybe not in a formal legal sense, but in practice, he's the leader of the opposition. So, of course, they're going to relentlessly pound him for saying something stupid like that. If he really wanted to get foreign diplomatic condemnation of India, first, I think that would be unwise. Second, even if he wanted it, it would be best for him to do it quietly in subtle in unreported conversations with diplomats abroad. The fact that he brings it out in a major speech shows that he thinks it's a political strategy, that he thinks that he can cast India, but he thinks that he can cast India in a negative light, the current government in a negative light, and thus convince Indians to vote for him. That is, he's a politician. He's not a political scientist or an analyst. He's not an NGO leader. He's a politician. So it's to me mostly it's indicative of a striking political naivete. I mean, I'm only an academic. I'm not even a political scientist. I'm a sociologist, and even I can tell that calling on foreign governments to chastise your country, it's simply not a good look.
Right, sir. Sir, I'd like to talk about Western media's portrayal of India. So if you look, sir, recently an Indian song, Natu Natu, it won the Oscar. it won the Oscars and as the best song. So
Natu Natu, or Desi Nach, or Nacho Nacho Nacho, depending which language you watch the movie in.
Exactly, sir. So if we look at BBC's coverage, they showed every winner, the best actor, the best actress, the best supporting actor, and every winner was shown except the best song. And when the time came to show the best song, they showed the nominations, not the winner. Now, sir,
I was unaware of that. I don't watch Oscars coverage, but go on. Yes, yeah.
Right, sir. Then, sir, if we look at a few years back, India went to the moon through its Chandrayaan mission, and the New York Times, it celebrated it with a very racist cartoon where a person with a bullock was knocking on the door of the elite space club. Then, sir, if you look at any commentary about our achievements or about India's achievement in the Western media, it is reduced at the end of the day. It is reduced down to, India should not focus on space. It should not focus on military achievement. Yeah. It should look, it is reduced to a very patronizing argument. So what are your views on that?
There are these anti-India tropes, and ultimately I think they come down to a casual, residual anti-Hinduism among Western ruling classes. And here I really want to emphasize, it is a narrow segment of the British or American population that has any kind of anti-Hinduism. This is not a widespread Hinduphobia, as often it's portrayed. There's no fear. There's no widespread population fear of Hindus along the lines of, say, Islamophobia, which is a real phenomenon in the U.S., maybe in the U.K., certainly here in Australia. Instead, there's a very narrow anti-Hinduism that is similar to what we see with anti-Semitism. So people who want to criticize Jews instead criticize the state of Israel as a more respectable way to express their anti-Semitism. And in the same way, people who want to criticize Hindus or who are internally or who are bigoted against Hindus can express that legitimately in the public debate by being anti-India and using India to stand in their mind for Hindus. That's reprehensible. It's unfortunate. That's very much an elite phenomenon. I think it is very much a hangover of colonialism. That is to say, the British anti-Hinduism of the cast of, say, Winston Churchill, right, who was utterly disparaging about Mahatma Gandhi and even about Jawaharlal Nehru. He sneered at these people as being almost subhuman, certainly sub-British. That sort of elite anti-Hinduism remains today embedded in a few elite institutions. Now, Dr. Rajiv Malhotra in New Jersey has done a lot of research on this, and I think he's absolutely correct that this has transitioned over from Oxbridge, Oxford and Cambridge being this center of imperial anti-Hinduism, to Harvard being the center of Anglo-American anti-Hinduism today. And along with Harvard, you have to talk about the Harvard ecosystem. Harvard, the New York Times, the Atlantic, Harper's, this whole set of institutions, publishing institutions that are staffed by Harvard graduates and surround Harvard training. Obviously, there's nothing official at Harvard that you could call anti-Hindu, but I suspect it's the sort of place where anti-Hindus congregate because they are welcome. Now, that's unfortunate. That's reality. It's something that Indians, and especially Indians in the diaspora, have to deal with. But the one reassuring thing I can say is that it has very, very little population support. I don't run into anybody outside academia and maybe a few journalists, anybody in Anglo-American Australian society who's anti-Hindu or who opposes India. There's instead a very broad enthusiasm for Indian successes, for the rise of India. The Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese he's just completed a visit to India. That's been breathlessly reported in Australia about the incredible things he's doing in India. There's not a hint in broader Australian or American society of anti-Hinduism. It is very much an elite Harvard, New York Times phenomenon.
Right, sir. So you mentioned about this slim minority who is anti-Hindu and they propagate their Hinduphobia. But do you think that this slim anti-Hindu elites who they have the control of the entire infrastructure and they are propagating their racial and anti-Hindu bias? Because I like to point towards the COVID-19 coverage. Because entire world was ravaged by multiple waves of COVID, different strands of COVID-19. If you look at US, a lot of people unfortunately died there. So all the media outlets, be it Fox, be it CNN, be it MSNBC, they came together and they said, look, we are not going to show you the visuals from the morgues, and we are going to respect the privacy of the people, and we would like them to mourn. Whereas the same outlets, the same Western outlets, when they came to India, they used drones. They used drones to capture the crematorium, to capture the intimate moments. Even in magazines, Modi has blood on his hand. These kinds of headings were used. So, do you think that there is an inherent racial bias and there is an inherent anti-Hindu bias by the elites, the small margin that you are talking about, but they actually control the entire ecosystem?
No, I think there's much more an openness to anti-India or anti-Hindu narratives than an explicit anti-Hinduism. Again, among a very narrow group, there's bigotry. But among the rest, remember, most of this reporting from India is not coming from Italian Americans who go to India to report. It's not coming from disinterested people. It's coming from people, almost all of them. I mean, most of the coverage of India that appears in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, when it's authored, or I'm reliably informed in The Economist, where it's not authored and it just appears under a corporate authorship, almost all this coverage is being driven by people whose family origins are in South Asia. whether they're Indian or Bangladeshi or Pakistani, or in the case of the New York Times chief correspondent in India, Afghan. There are people who have strong relationships with India and many reasons to be either explicitly anti-Indian. So if they're of Pakistani origin or Bangladeshi origin and they have an axe to grind against India, or they are people who are opposed to the current BJP government in India and think that by telling a bad story about India, they're telling a bad story about the BJP. So it's not so much India is incompetent, but, oh, look, the BJP government is incompetent. We're going to show this by giving this dramatic drone footage of people fleeing from the cities, these long lines of COVID refugees. So the coverage is not being driven by the interests of neutral American observers, almost because these positions are highly coveted. These positions are almost all filled by people who have a personal desire to be the India correspondent of the New York Times, of NBC News, of CNN, which are almost all people of South Asian extraction. Now, we in the liberal West have the pro forma view. We don't question individuals' ethnic backgrounds. And if we have two people applying for the job of Delhi correspondent, we will not distinguish between the person who is Scotch-Irish American and the person who is Punjabi American. We won't impugn any motives to the Punjabi American. Now, in reality, of course, people who are of Punjabi extraction are going to have personal axes to grind when they go to India in the way that a Scotch-Irish person won't. Now, we've seen this transition over the last 20 years from most of the foreign correspondents covering India having no connection to India to most of them being children of the diaspora or themselves members of the diaspora. That is, I think, increasing in a way, the knowledge of India in the West. That is, people who have more knowledge are reporting to us, but it's also introducing personal biases. And unfortunately, the editors at these newspapers, magazines, and TV stations are not equipped to detect those biases. They simply take the reports at face value. And that's a failure of editorial oversight. That's something that people are very ideologically committed to. I can't question my Bengali analyst because she's Bengali. That would be unfair somehow. And it is unfair and it is wrong. But in the same way that, if your person covering there's a notorious case in Wired magazine of the one negative review of the new Harry Potter video game was written by a correspondent for Wired magazine who is herself transsexual. And she viciously attacked the game because the game has been politicized that the Harry Potter author, J.K. Rowling has been vilified as being transphobic. And so, when you give the transsexual author the opportunity to review the video game, she doesn't review it. I mean, everyone knows she's not reviewing it objectively, but we can't say that. We can't say that because we can't assume that transsexual people will allow their prejudices to influence the reporting. In the same way, well, we can't allow our knowledge that, the Bengali, the Punjabi, the Pakistani person is going to allow her or his personal biases affect India coverage. We can't say it. Yeah, we all know it. And I always encourage people who are always sending me articles about, because people in the West have come to know that I've been writing positive things about Indian democracy. They're constantly sending me articles. Salvatore, how can you defend Indian democracy when fill in the blank your favorite publication says that India is no longer a democracy? And I always roll my eyes and I say, look at the name of the author on that article. You just have to live in the real world where people have political passions. Even if pro forma, we have to all accept that I can't exclude someone from covering India just because the person is of Indian background.
Right, sir. So whenever you come to India, so you become a topic of your discussion, and every news channel.
It's very amusing, yes, to me. We
see your popularity on Twitter, and it's massive. and every news channel wants to get a piece of you. Uh, I just wanted to address the elephant in the room, your interview with News Laundry. Uh,
Sure.
if you look at it, it looked like a proper, well thought out hit job or an ambush, if I may say so, because you are a person who is one of the rare species who is talking positively about India, and when we look at that whole interview, when we went through that, there are lots of cuts, there are a lot of silly background noises, and
Yeah.
even after you told them that please release the entire video, they took it private, and there was a lot of
Yeah.
drama around that. So do you think there is a in the Indian liberal spectrum, there is a resistance to listen to the other side of argument? Because
No, look, I don't want to generalize from that. Look, if there's something distinctive about me, it's not that I've said positive things about Indian democracy. It's that I'm happy to talk to everybody. And I really am happy to talk to everybody. I view myself as a teacher, not as a political warrior of some kind. I'm not Hindu, I'm not Indian. I have no stake in this. I'm just an academic analyst who is thrilled to have the opportunity to teach people sometimes about their own country, because I'm studying their country, whereas they've simply lived there. And so I'm very happy to have the opportunity to teach. So I accept all interview requests, and I don't vet people. I've done more than 100 interviews about India over the last year, and I've only had one negative experience. Now, I've had a lot of people who disagreed with me, but most people who maybe take a different view, most of them are civil. I mean, who made me famous in India? Rajdeep Sardesai. Rajdeep Sardesai disagrees with me. He even, after our interview, he even went and made a video criticizing me. So he thoroughly disagreed with me and what I was saying. But we had a civil interview. He was professional. I have no complaints about my interactions with him, and I have no complaints about him later making a personal opinion video in which he criticized me. Of course, he disagrees with me. That's fine. We all do have that. The problem with the News Laundry interview wasn't that it was negative or disagreeing. It said it simply wasn't an interview. It was, as you called it, your words, a hit job. And I was shocked when I did the interview that the person I was interviewing with frankly admitted, I don't know if they cut that out later, but he frankly admitted in our interview on screen that he was not a journalist. I said at one point, you're simply not behaving like a journalist. And he said, that's because I'm not a journalist. It's like, well, then why am I interviewing with you? My whole, of all the 100 or more interviews I've done, it's the only interview that has not been simply published in full on the internet. It's the only interview where clips have been taken out to try to make me sound disreputable. And what I found most rewarding about the whole News Laundry experience was that before I tried to break their paywall and I did some cute things. And I'll admit I was mischievous with News Laundry after the whole interview. But before all of that, when they first published an interview on their website, the top upvoted comment on their website was why are you being such a jerk? This person, Salvatore, seems very nice. And that was upvoted by their own subscribers. That's really what I want to emphasize. Even the News Laundry audience, which is Indian, not just liberals. I mean, the News Laundry, these are people who have paying. Could you imagine yourself having a paying subscription to News Laundry? Okay, so among people who have a paid subscription to News Laundry, the top comment was, Abhinandan, why are you being such a jerk? Salvatore seems really genuine, and he's just trying to answer, faithful. We want to hear what he has to say. I took that as an incredible validation that it's not, it's not just quote unquote right wingers in India or Hindu nationalists, who want to hear the facts. Everyone in India wants to hear the facts, including leftists, liberals, critics of India. They all want to hear the facts. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to take my research and bring it to people of any persuasion, not simply to sympathetic audiences.
Right, sir. Well, sir, we do have a couple of questions before we let you go. First is related to the Indian diaspora. Because we almost have 10 million people who are living abroad who identify as of Indian origin, and almost as many people who have an Indian passport and are living. We call them NRIs. So
Yeah.
if you see, sir, Indian Americans or Indians in UK, Indians in Germany, Indians in Europe, they are the best performing immigrants because they have
Yeah.
the highest per capita income, the lowest incarceration rates. They are very law abiding.
Yeah.
They pay
Model
very,
immigrants. Yeah.
exactly. And this is these are not my words. These are the words of senators and congressmen. So if you see, since Prime Minister Modi has come to the fore, these people, these immigrants, they have been put under a lot of pressure. Any person who shows pride towards India's achievement while being in the United States or the United Kingdom, he or she is automatically labeled as a Hindutva fascist or a Hindutva goon. Then, sir, we look at the recent Seattle anti-caste legislation. There, sir, seems to target, well-integrated second or third generation American Indians who are very well integrated into the American culture, the United States culture, and they do not have any recollection of which caste they belong to. But then also it has been very vigorously pushed by
Yeah.
by the entire ecosystem that no, if you are Indian, if you are of certain color, if you are of certain heritage, you are a casteist. So what are your views on this? Do you think that these attacks on the Indian diaspora will only increase in the near future?
So first, let's put Seattle, Leicester, Melbourne aside for a minute and focus on the diaspora itself. There are two Indian diasporas. There's the one you've mentioned, and then of course there's the working diaspora in the Gulf, Singapore, people who are working in work camps on minimal wages. And both of those diasporas are viewed as model migrants. And I think it's something it's really important to remember. I mean, the Gulf Arab states, they can get manual labor from anywhere in the world. They're choosing to come to India because they also view completely uneducated, well, not completely, but relatively uneducated manual workers in construction and service. They're viewing Indians as their preferred laborers. That's something that gets very little attention. No one really thinks about that. They could be going anywhere in the world. Well, anywhere in the poor world. They could be going to Africa. They could be going all over South Asia, and they're coming to India. So the Indian migrants are considered model immigrants, not just in the rich countries where they're financially successful, but even in places where they're very poor and relatively exploited. They're still considered the premium migrants to have. So I think it's something that Indians can be proud of, that wherever they go in the world, Indians are desired. And that's why I said there's not a broad Hinduphobia. And no one is worried about, bringing Hindus into their households to work in their households in the Gulf, even though the Gulf is nearly 100% Muslim, and much of the country where Indians are there are Wahhabi Sunni Muslims. I mean, many of them extreme Muslims. They're not upset about having Hindus in their households in the way that people might be upset with having people of other religions and other nationalities in their households. So I think it's something that doesn't get enough attention that really should get attention. And in the same way in the West, of course, we embrace, firms embrace having Indian engineers, Indian doctors. There's some discrimination along the line, medicine, of people feeling they don't want the competition. But there's not discrimination in the sense of people being Hinduphobic. Oh, I don't want a Hindu touching me, or I'm afraid of the Hindu might harm me. There's almost none of that. I mean, I'm sure it's been experienced somewhere, but it's very rare. Okay, so to put the context, to set the table, so to speak, Indians are considered model immigrants in virtually every jurisdiction at every income level, not just the successful ones. Then we have the question, why has there been violence and conflict involving Hindu immigration? We've seen the Khalistan desecration of Hindu temples in Melbourne. We've seen the violent clashes in Leicester, and now we see this legislation in Seattle, so this explicit attempt to try to vilify Hindus in Seattle for caste discrimination. And these, I think, have much more to do with explicit anti-Hinduism, and that anti-Hinduism comes from different causes. For the Khalistanis, the anti-Hinduism is very, I don't want to use the word natural, is very obvious. I mean, why are they anti-Hindu? Because their goal is to have a separate Khalistan, and they view Hindu India as a barrier to that. So let's use the word, it is rational anti-Hinduism. The anti-Hinduism in Leicester, again, it's rational anti-Hinduism. I don't endorse it. I'm saying that conservative Muslims of Pakistani origin in Leicester who resent Indian success, yeah, it's rational for them to be anti-Hindu. Not excusable, not forgivable, not appropriate, but rational. What we have instead in America with the Seattle issue, with the dismantling global Hindutva movement in the United States, is an irrational, bigoted anti-Hinduism. And I think we need to keep that separate because it's not driven by people who have a rational reason for opposing India or Hindus. You know, when a Kashmiri separatist opposes Hindu India, well, what do you expect them to do? They're a Kashmiri separatist. It's in their dharma to be opposed to Hindu India. But why is an academic association in the United States attempting to vilify Hindus? Why is a union movement, a set of union activists in Seattle, attempting to vilify Hindus and Hinduism? And that, to me, really comes down to anti-Hindu bigotry of a narrow intellectual class who are weaponizing the institutional levers of power that they know how to work. And I've seen that very much with the American dismantling global Hindutva movement. They're clearly using the same toolkit that's been used for anti-Zionism is now being used for anti-Hindutva activism. They're pulling all the same levers. They're taking advantage of people's goodwill and ignorance. So, for example, the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, they went to organizations like the American Historical Association, the American Sociological Association. They said, we've faced attacks by Hindu nationalists who don't want our conference to go forward. Would you endorse a letter saying we condemn attacks on academics? Well, what's the American Sociological Association going to do? They're not going to commission an investigation. They're asked at the executive level, would you support, they're provided with the letter, and they're saying, would you endorse this letter that says we condemn attacks on academics who pursue this dismantling global? Of course they condemn the attacks. Then that letter gets put on the website of the Dismantling Global Hindutva, letter of support from American Sociological. Now, the American Sociological Association had no idea what it was supporting. It just pro forma stamped, yes, we support this. Same thing in Seattle. The union members in Seattle who allowed their unions to be weaponized in this legislation, to support this legislation banning caste discrimination. Well, if you go to an ordinary person who knows nothing about India and you say, this person here identifies as Dalit, he says he's faced caste discrimination, that's terrible. Shouldn't that be banned? Why wouldn't you ban it? I mean, an ordinary, uninformed union member would just, again, shrug his or her shoulders and say, well, yeah, we don't want discrimination of any kind. They're not commissioning, these unions aren't commissioning investigations into the reality of caste discrimination. They're simply being approached. It's not coming up organically from the union members. It's an outside group approaching the union saying, we want to ban caste discrimination. Here's one of your members says he's faced caste discrimination. You should support this member. And it's all very strategic. It's all from this playbook. It's the same as the anti-Zionist playbook. My own union here at the University of Sydney has condemned Israel repeatedly. Now, why is a University of Sydney staff union condemning Israel? Because, well, you have an executive meeting of the union. 30 anti-Semitic activists show up. They put a resolution forward saying we condemn Israel. It's an open meeting, so they outvote all the people who don't want to write about this, don't want to care about this issue. They outvote them, and so the union officially records, the union executive meeting has condemned Israel. And we see this. I mean, I see this all the time in academia. All these resolutions, and the point is that the people. It's not the organizations that are anti-India or anti-Hindu. It's the small number of activists who weaponize the organization. So I want to reassure Indians, there aren't a group of Washington state unions that are anti-India or anti-Hindu. There are a small number of activists who've exploited the open procedures and, let's face it, the good hearts of people who, when told about a supposed problem, are sympathetic. But it's a very narrow segment of people who are behind this kind of bigotry. It's not a society-wide phenomenon.
Right. Sir, the last question that we have for you is that if you see, you talked about the operations of NGOs when we were talking about the VDEM rankings. Is our international NGOs, they are allowed to operate in India or not?
Yeah.
So do you think these NGOs, because they are, if you check their funding source, so do you think these NGOs, they are used as a tool of geopolitics, as a tool of, tightening the noose around India? Because if we see, if India goes for any big ticket project, be it a nuclear reactor to provide electricity to its people, be it a dam to provide irrigation to its poor farmers. So every time India seems to go for these big ticket projects, there is a very harsh, if I may say so, a very harsh opposition by an NGO ecosystem, and they exploit India's open constitutional provisions, and they seem to stall it. And moving forward, sir, because within 12 months' time, less than 12 months' time, we are going for a general election, and Prime Minister Modi, he will be seeking a third term in office, which is an unprecedented feat. So, do you think that attacks through NGOs and attacks through the Western elitist media, it will increase on India?
So, first, when you think about NGOs, and especially prominent international NGOs, you have to ask the question, are they being used by whom? They don't have interests of their own, so to speak. Instead, they become captured by their own staff and the people who are willing or strongly desire to work for these NGOs. Most NGOs are founded by a founding generation who truly believe in their cause. And then they professionalize, and as they professionalize, they come to be captured by the people who work for them, because there are no shareholders to impose order. Ultimately, it's the people who work for them who define their agendas. Now, some NGOs, for example, notoriously, Human Rights Watch has effectively been captured by international Islamists. Now, they've got a great website, the great rhetorical territory, "We are Human Rights Watch," that sounds so reputable. In fact, the organization is now, I wouldn't say completely dominated by international Islamists, but is so infiltrated by international Islamists who targeted Human Rights Watch and who said, well, how do we get influence? Well, we get our people to go work for Human Rights Watch and, get the applications in, give people great recommendations, donate money, do all things to try to get into this organization. It's become so infiltrated by international Islamists that when any issue arises at Human Rights Watch that is of interest to international Islamists, that group, I think, strongly affects the positions Human Rights Watch will take. It's not completely determinative. There are many issues in which Human Rights Watch is excellent because it has nothing to do with this. So Human Rights Watch on China might be great, on North Korea might be great, but in anything to do with Muslim majority countries, Israel, or India, Human Rights Watch is terrible, because international Islamists have an undue influence over the agenda at the organization. And other organizations have similar sorts of biases. So, for example, the John Templeton Foundation is very closely connected with Christian missionaries. They fund a lot of work, including the Pew Research Center's International Religious Freedom Project. Now, the Templeton Foundation is a mainstream foundation, but they will encourage the people who receive their funding to define freedom of religion in a certain way. So when they operationalize international religious freedom, it's overwhelmingly concerned with, can you proselytize? And can you send international missionaries to proselytize? It's not enough that local missionaries can proselytize, that local people can propagate their own religion. They make it an important issue. Can international missionaries proselytize? Again, reflecting the interests of the funders or the people who are and who volunteers to work for these religious freedom organizations. Well, children of missionaries, people who've been involved in mission efforts. So we see a lot of international NGOs being undermined by the enthusiasms of the people who work for them. You mentioned earlier about India being named the rape capital of the world. Well, who is going to go work for a women's security NGO? Well, people who've been the victims of sexual violence, people who are, extremely interested in the issue, a dispassionate, a male heterosexual quantitative sociologist is very unlikely to end up leading a rape crisis NGO. Now, that's as it should be. I mean, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying that it embeds certain points of view in the NGOs. And unfortunately for a government like the BJP government in India and a person like Narendra Modi, most of those international NGOs are viscerally opposed to everything that party and that person stand for. And the staff members become self-indulgent. They use the machinery at their disposal. If you are a visceral opponent of Narendra Modi and you are an analyst at Human Rights Watch India, of course, you try to write what you think is and I'm not saying that they don't really think it. You try to write what you think is the most important research possible, research that condemns the current government, which you view as fascist. Now, the fact that objectively the government is not fascist, the fact that objectively the government is not anti-woman, the fact that objectively more women vote for this party than men vote for this party, that doesn't enter the calculation. It's the personal priorities of the people working at NGOs that determine the agenda. So, yes, these organizations are vehemently, viscerally opposed to Narendra Modi and the BJP. On the other hand, will that have any practical effect on elections? Probably not. So, in a way, being condemned by an international NGO is almost in itself a badge of honor among the people who would vote for the BJP. So I don't think it has much of an effect on practical politics. What it does have an effect on is Western perceptions of India. And that's really where the issue arises. The question is not, will Narendra Modi win or lose an election because Human Rights Watch condemns him? The question is, will the United States ultimately dial back Quad cooperation because Human Rights Watch condemns India? That's where it has an effect.
Right, sir. So when we went to our viewers and audience and we said that, we are going to have Dr. Babones on our show, and we would like you to ask questions, put your questions that we might put to Dr. Babones, and we thought, we'll open it for a week or so, and we'll get around a few questions and that we can put to you. So within 24 hours, we received over 300 questions.
Then why did you waste so much time? We should have just spent a whole session. I'm inviting you right now to do another interview in April,
right,
where we just go through the questions. I'd be absolutely thrilled.
Absolutely, sir. Because just so you know, sir, we have used the inputs from our readers in the question.
Yeah, I know. I'm kidding you. I'm kidding you.
Right,
yes.
Right. And definitely, sir, we will be up for another interview. But sir, this is a testimony to your popularity, and you would be thrilled to know that our readers, they are majority from the 18 to 24-year-old age group. So these are college students who are very passionate about Indian geopolitics and whatever is happening. And so I actually got a call at 1 a.m. in the night, and it was by one of our subscriber, and he said, "Are you prepared? Are you prepared for the interview? Please do not mess this up. We would like to watch it."
I'm not that important, but thank you. It's very kind.
Right,
it's very endearing.
So just so you know, sir, because you are very popular in the 18 to 24 age group, and we would love to associate with you again in the near future. And thank you so much for your time, and it was an eye-opening 50-60 minutes with you. So thank you so much, and Har Har Mahadev. Thank you so much.
Look, Ram Ram, thank you for the invitation to come speak. And I'm very serious. Let's book an interview for April in which we don't indulge any of our own preferences. We instead just go straight to the questions from the listeners. I would absolutely love that.
Thank you so much, sir. That will be on very high on our agenda. And thank you so much for your time, and wish you a very great day ahead.
Bye-bye.